Let's talk about why you need life experience and I would say work experience to write a good story. One of the main characters and one of the most diabolical characters in my Dwellers Beneath the Arches series is inspired by a girl I used to know. Imagine being in a dark country house in England. You're isolated, it's a large house, maybe 7 bedrooms, very stately, brick, work, fireplaces, huge gardens. You're asleep on the sofa in the large living room. It's very warm. Outside, a storm is raging. The storm conveniently blocks out any external noise. You're dozing off on the couch, but then you feel a presence. You open your eyes, you look up, and there is a figure in the doorway. It's about 2 a.m. and a young girl with dark blonde hair stands there, staring at you. And you know why she's there. She's standing there to check if you've finally fallen asleep. That is the 4th time she's checked on you that night. Now, this isn't some sort of well-written nightmare. This is actually reality. This was a home for emotionally complex children and teenagers that I worked at in England for a duration of time. It was very isolated. It was in the countryside, and we worked with some very complex children with very complex needs. People often ask where I get my inspiration for my characters from. In some instances, some of the characters are inspired by something as simple as the smell of coffee in the morning. I remember one of the characters in my coat series being inspired by the leather on a man's shoes, the type of leather that was used. So it's very, very little distinct details that can trigger an entire character. But with some of the characters I've got in my books, particularly in the Dwellers series, some of them have come from people I've known or children I've encountered and teenagers I've encountered in my life as well. Over the years, I would take on and off part-time work, working with children and teens. A lot of the work was fairly normal, fairly innocent, maybe children who had not been well taken care of and the authorities had intervened, and we were taking care of the kids whilst the parents were taught how to care for their children properly. However, there was a certain segment of the population, and these were kids who had been so traumatized and were now so fragile and were of a very emotionally fragile state that they were no longer fit to be on their own. They were no longer fit to be in society, and they were always analysed by professionals, psychiatrists, psychologists, professionals at the top of the mental health and professionals at the top of the mental health game. These children had to be assessed very regularly because they were trying to see if they were a good fit to come back into society. This girl that was watching me that night was one of the young people who had failed the assessments numerous times. So it was up to us as support workers and care workers to watch her around the clock. Some of these children were on a 24-hour watch where they were watched constantly and could not be on their own. And if you were a night support worker, like I was that night, you didn't fall asleep because anything could happen. It was a very delicate situation where you wanted to observe their human rights and their rights to be young children by letting them roam freely around the house because these were their households. But you had to be careful at the same time. You had to be able to watch yourself. You had to be able to make sure you were safe and you were protected and guarded at all times. So you couldn't really doze off, especially on a night shift. And that night I was extremely tired because the facility was short-staffed and I'd done a few double shifts. And I dozed off for just a few minutes, and then I woke up because I felt a presence, and she was standing there quietly, watching me. She didn't move a muscle. And when she realized I was awake and I was watching her, she just disappeared. She walked back and went back to her bedroom. When you have a chilling experience like that with maybe kids or young people watching you, and you work in this sorts of environment, you are going to get a lot of character inspiration, especially the darker characters. Now, when people think about thrillers or scary moments in books, and it's not the jump scare, it's not the bloody gore, it's the very silent characters, the ones who observe, the ones who are able to wait, and the ones who are able to watch. Now, when I first wrote the Dweller series, this character didn't exist because I did not have the required life experience and work experience. When I first wrote The Dwellers, I wrote it when I was a kid, and I've centered the entire series around Christmas time, and it was all about someone going around stealing Christmas presents. It was very sweet, it was very quaint, it was very innocent, but to make a good story, you need a bit of danger, you need a good balance between good and bad, good and evil. So I was very grateful for the work experience I was able to receive, even though sometimes I did feel like I was in jeopardy. But I was very grateful because it helped me craft the books, craft the villains in the story, and craft the entire premise of the book. Obviously, my series is still set at Christmas time in London. However, what has changed is the characters. The characters are a lot more intense. They mimic a lot more of what goes on in reality. They have the same expressions, they have the same feelings that we would have. So it's not all fantasies and lovely fairy tales, and it's a bit of reality in it as well. I was very grateful for this experience. It was one of those part-time jobs, I had on and off over the years. And I never quite stayed in it long enough because something was always happening and you had to be so careful. And when you're hyper vigilant all the time, it does affect you a bit because you never quite learn to calm down and to rest. So I had to take time off away from it to sort of cut back and rest and recuperate and then come back into it. So if you ever read the Dweller series and you read of a character called Nanette was inspired by some of these kids I worked with, and particularly by that girl. So when people ask, oh, well, my book didn't sell, or my book is not working, I'm only a teen, or I'm, a 12-year-old girl or boy trying to write, I always say give it time, because the more you work and the more life experience you have, the more interesting, potentially, your characters could become. When I have my readers writing to me, they mention these group of teens in the books because they were absolutely fascinating. However, I wonder how fascinating the readers would still find it if they realize that the mimes, they were called the mimes, in the Dweller series were actually inspired by real-life teens that I'd actually met. Have a lovely day.